Hey everybody. As people start to filter in, I'm just going to let some music play and wait a minute or two and make sure that everything is running smoothly. And I'll probably kick this off at 10:04. So bear with me for a minute while we make sure that everything's getting recorded and coming in correctly, and then we'll kick it off here in a few minutes. So hold tight. I think that we are looking good. Littell, you were able to join back in. Everything good on the other workshop?
Seems so.
All right, perfect. So before we get started, I just want to mention a couple quick housekeeping things. So everyone is aware we are recording this session and we will probably post this somewhere afterwards. Another quick Zoom webinar note is that when you're sending messages in the chat, you want to change it so it says all panelists and all attendees so that it doesn't just send to me and it sends to the entire chat. And also at the end, we're going to do a Q&A, and we're also going to have a feedback form that you can fill out to give us more information about what you enjoyed and what you would like to improve for next time. So a couple housekeeping things, but with that being said, let's just jump right in. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lee Robinson, and I'm a developer, a writer, and the creator of two courses, Mastering Next.js and React 2020. And today we're going to be talking about how to build static sites with Next.js and Prisma. And the agenda for today, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of Next.js. It's going to be beginner friendly if you've never worked with it, so don't worry about that. I'm going to give a small overview of Prisma, which I'm sure you'll learn much more about tomorrow. We're going to dive into the starter repo that was provided in the email sent out. If you don't have that, let me just drop a link to that in the chat right now. You'll want to make sure that you have Node.js set up and also clone this repository and install your dependencies so that we can run this locally. This is going to be the jumping off point for us in the workshop, so we want to make sure that everyone has this. And then once we dive into this code, we're going to check out the Prisma schema. We're going to add some functionality to query from our database and start building out our site. Finally, at the end, we're going to do a little bit of styling using a component library called Chakra UI. We're going to deploy our application with Vercel. And then I'm going to kind of throw out some ideas of how you could take this even further based on what we've covered today and build on top of this as a foundation for the future. And then there'll be plenty of time for questions. I'm going to leave it pretty open so that you guys can throw out anything related to Next.js or the combination of Next.js and Prisma, and I'll do my best to answer anything that you have. So I'm going to share my screen. A quick question, is this going to be uploaded? Yes, it will be recorded and uploaded. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'm going to pull up the chat just so I have it available. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is give a quick overview of Next.js for those who are not familiar. So most of you are probably familiar with React, which is a very popular framework for creating single-page applications with JavaScript. If you've worked with Vue or Angular, it's very similar to those, except better. And Next.js is a framework on top of React. So React allows you to build reusable component-based interfaces, and Next.js includes everything that you need to build performant, scalable React applications. Now, the big benefit, in my opinion, of Next.js is that it has a hybrid approach for data fetching. And what this means is that on a per page basis, I can choose how I want to fetch my data and how that page is going to be served to my users. So the best way to conceptualize this and think about it is if you take a tangible example of a company that has a landing page, maybe a blog, but then it also has a customer or client dashboard where it's got a very data dense UI and there's a lot of information being fetched there that's dynamic. The index page, the marketing pages, the blog, those are going to want to be static because we want those to be very reliable and have as little downtime as possible by serving static files. We want them to be performant by putting those static files behind a CDN, and we want them to have great SEO. And all of those things are achievable through static sites, traditionally used through something like a static site generator. Now, if we look at our dashboard, our client dashboard, we want to have really data dense page, but we don't want to send all of that data over the wire on the server because it would slow down the initial time to first byte. And that time to first byte is just a metric that we can use to track the performance of that page. So in this case, the best approach for performance would be to client-side render that page. Now, client-side rendering has been popularized by React, Angular, Vue, and basically it just means that the JavaScript that is executing on the client side is doing that data fetching and then populating that data on the screen. So it's going to make a request to fetch some data and then show your client dashboard. Now, for traditional static site generators, think of like Jekyll or Hugo. It wasn't possible to do this hybrid approach where I want half of my site to be static and I want the other half to have some client-side rendering or even some server-side rendering. And Next.js is really that first framework that allows you to combine all of those inside of the bounds of a single framework. So as you add in new pages with new data fetching requirements, you don't have to escape the bounds of the framework that you have and use another tool. So that's really great. And the final one I want to touch on too that we won't mess with today, but it's good to know about, is doing server-side rendering. And a good example of this might be, think of a Facebook news feed. You have highly dynamic content that needs to be immediately refreshed when you reload the browser and have the most up-to-date content. And this is a good candidate for server-side rendering. We're not going to talk about that today. We're instead going to be talking about static site generation because a lot of the benefits of server-side rendering are starting to be taken over by static site generation, namely performance and SEO. And there's less use cases for traditional server-side rendering as you might think of it right now than there were before. So we're going to talk specifically about static site generation with Next. A couple other things I want to mention with Next.js that are really handy is file system-based routing. So if you've ever worked with React Router, you're probably familiar with React Router or Reach Router. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with these. It's just you have to set it up after the fact. And the thing that I like about Next.js is that it gives a kind of batteries included approach to including this routing for you, similar to how Rails does things. And if you make a new file, for example, at pages/index or pages/about, all you need to do is export a React component, and that will render out as whatever your URL is /about, for example. So this makes it really easy to scale out your application. Another awesome thing is automatic code splitting. So again, this is something that you can customize with React and React Router, but the great thing about Next.js is that it's just included. So if I visit /about, I'm only going to get the JavaScript for that page. And this is really important for performance and making sure that your users get served the fastest page possible, which also will impact your Google search rankings. So you want to have those fast pages, and code splitting really helps out with that. So some fun stats about Next.js. There's over 350,000 Next.js devs now, and it just grows more day by day. And that's actually over 30% of all React devs. So a lot of React devs are moving towards this wave of building with frameworks on top so that they have sensible defaults. And there's over 300,000 weekly NPM downloads, which is crazy. So long story short, the adoption of Next.js is growing very quickly. And I was exploring Next.js and Prisma, and that's really what got me into this space and interested about the combination of the two. So I'm sure you'll learn more tomorrow about Prisma, but the best way for me to sum it up is that it just makes accessing databases really easy. So Prisma is going to provide an auto-generated and type-safe queries based on your database, whether you provide your own database to start with, or you are using one that is built from the ground up. Prisma is going to make it really easy for you to access that content. Now, traditionally, you would put an API on top of your database to separate that front-end code and then your back-end logic. And the thing that was really interesting to me about the conversation of Next.js and Prisma was that with Next.js 9.3 and the new static site generation methods that were included, you can actually short-circuit that process and go directly to the database. So rather than building out an API on top of your database and using Prisma to make queries against that database, you can make queries directly from your React components. And for those of you who have programmed for a while, this idea isn't necessarily new, but it hasn't been executed well in the single page application space in, let's say, the last 5 years. So this is a really exciting opportunity and a really unique conversation that ultimately saves you time that will allow you to produce your applications faster. So that's what got me excited about Next.js and Prisma. One thing that's really cool with the static site generation methods is that they are only ran on the server. So what that means is that it's ran in the Node.js context. That's why you're able to go directly to the database with Prisma, because the code that gets shipped is actually not sent to the browser. So the Vercel team made a really helpful demo here at nextcodeelimination.now.sh, where if you paste in any arbitrary Next.js code over here on the left, it actually shows you what happens when this gets compiled. And you'll see that we were using some of these static site generation methods, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more here in a second. But you see that they're not actually compiled over when this gets sent to production. So this is just something good to know, that we're not actually shipping that to the browser. And that allows us to go directly to the database. So that's a quick overview of Next.js. I'm happy to go further into any of these topics. Feel free to ask me questions in the Q&A section. What I want to do now is have everyone move to the starter repo, which I believe I put in the chat. This, you want to make sure this is cloned and installed running locally. And I want to just quickly run through what I've provided to get us started. And then we'll start jumping in and making some improvements on top of this. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Prisma schema. So if we take a look, we have the database that we're using, which is this file, dev.db, and I've seeded this with some information. And then we are using the Prisma client, and I've defined 2 different models. So I have a song and an artist. And the artist has a one-to-many relationship. For one artist, we can have multiple songs. And then for every song, we have some information like the ID and the name and which artist was associated to it. So with this information, we're going to create an application today that you can view at next-prisma.now.sh, which I'll just put that in the chat. And we're going to create an application that looks like this. It is a list of some songs that I like, and this is read from a Prisma database. And at build time, it is compiled into a static site and then hosted on Vercel behind a CDN. So it's really fast. So when you see each one of these cards is a clickable link, and if I click into here, you'll see a really fast client-side transition using Next.js. And then I have a link to the YouTube video where I can watch it, as well as a link to go back. So pretty cool. We're going to start from a scaled down version of this that doesn't have all the polish on it, and then work towards something that looks like this. So open up your Next Prisma starter, and here is our schema. So what I want you to do is go to package.json. If you're using VS Code and you hit Command P, that's what brings up the ability to quickly find files. And inside of this package.json, I've included some helpful scripts. And one of those scripts is DB. Now I'm going to be using yarn today, but feel free to use npm. So if I run yarn DB, this is going to start up Prisma Studio, which gives us a visual GUI for our database. So we're able to view all of the tables and columns and actually make modifications here and save it back to the database. So we have 5 different songs that are seated in this database, and you see they're linked to an artist. And if I go over here, I can also look at the artist table and see these 5 artists. So we have some information in our database. This is a great start. Let's run our application locally. So if I kill that and I run yarn dev, that's going to start up the next server at localhost 3000. So our server will be running at localhost 3000, and we're going to visit the index route. So visiting the index route right now, it just shows test song. So let's pull up this code and see what we're working with right now. So the first thing we see is getStaticProps. getStaticProps is one of the Next.js 9.3 static site generation methods. And essentially what it does is it allows you to run any code in the node context, fetch any data from an API or a database, and then return that as props to the React component that you export from this file. So for example, I'm hard coding a list of songs to be this fake song test song, and I used the key of songs. And we see that then when I destructure the props passed into this React component, I'm able to access songs and then loop over those songs and display a list of items. So for example, if I were to take this and make a new one and say this is test 2, test song 2, and save this, you're going to see that rebuild and the new song show up. You'll notice that was really quick, and that's because Next.js 9.4, the newest version, includes what they call React Fast Refresh, which is essentially the new way of doing hot module reloading. And it just makes it really fast to see your changes update while not losing any state on the client side. But obviously we don't want these hard-coded songs. So what we're going to do is hook up Prisma and query from the database. So to do that, let's first define a connection to Prisma. And you'll see I'm using VS Code to get this auto import here for Prisma client. So define a connection to Prisma client, and then we want to fetch all of the songs. So you see this is an asynchronous function. We're going to await the result of querying our database. So Prisma dot whatever model that we want, and we want the song model. And then we want to find many results, not just one. So we want all of the results. So let's do that, and let's also pass in some arguments to finding many. And the argument that we want is we want to also include the artist model. So for a song, it has a relation to an artist. We also want to include that information here. So this will fetch all the songs as well as their artists. And then rather than returning this hard-coded list, we can remove this and just do songs. And what you're seeing here is this shorthand object notation where songs is mapping directly to the key of songs is mapping to this variable songs. So if we save this, let's see, unable to open database. I could be in a bad state because I was practicing this before. So I'm going to regenerate my Prisma client, which I'll touch on that more here in a little bit. Let me restart this and make sure we're on board. There we go. I was running through it beforehand to make sure I didn't screw anything up. You gotta love live demos, right? So I'm able to query the 5 songs in the database. And now instead of the hard-coded information, I'm able to see the actual songs that are pulling from the database. I'll try to follow along the chat as I can, but I don't want to get too distracted by it. So I'll try to periodically stop at places and read through here. Let me pull up my extensions in VS Code. A common question that I get is which theme do I use? And that's Sorcerer. And then I would also recommend the Prisma plugin so that you can get syntax highlighting. For auto imports, I believe this auto import ES6TS JSX is what I use to get that, which is very helpful. Other than that, there's nothing else in here I think that is relevant to what we're doing today. But feel free to message me if you need more questions about extensions. So we are querying our songs now, which is a good start. But now we want to make sure that when we go to a song, we can actually click into a title and make it so that we can navigate to that page. So we have a list item, but we want to make this a link to that page. So I'm going to cut this and we're going to use Next.js link. So Next.js link is going to allow us to do the client-side navigation to that page. And we're going to make the first child of that needs to be an A, which we will come back to. But for now, let's just do song.name. We need to also import this. And then we need to tell it which route to go to. So with Next.js link, we're going to use href, and that's going to tell it which file or which route to go to. So specifically for this, the file that we have defined is /songs and then @ID. Now this ID is a dynamic route. And what this means is that I can pass in any ID here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that gets forwarded along to that route. So we want to go to this page, but when we're actually rendering this to the client, we want to render it as songs at whatever the ID of that song is. So this is using an ES6 string template, and we are putting this variable directly into this string. So this will evaluate to song/1, song/2, etc. So now these will be links to the song pages, which will be the next route that we talk about. I'm going to open up this page. And if we go over here and we click into one of these links, you'll see that we do that client-side navigation, and we're able to see this YouTube video. Now, again, this is hard-coded right now. So what we want to do is hook this up to real data. So if we take a look over here on the left, we talked a little bit about getStaticProps, which is forwarding that information to the React component. But there's one other method in here that we haven't talked about, and that's getStaticPaths. So getStaticPaths works in conjunction with dynamic routes. So what this is going to do is say, based on my data, generate X number of static pages for this dynamic route. So for example, we have ID here. We want to say that for all of the songs, generate a path for every ID. We want songs at 1, songs at 2, songs at 3, etc. And right now, it only knows about one route. It only knows about songs at ID. If I were to do songs at 2, right now, it doesn't know what that is, so at 404s. So we want to change this so that it has all of the different song IDs possible. So let's first start with getStaticProps. We want to go inside here and fetch information about this specific song that we're looking at. So again, we are going to make a connection to Prisma with the Prisma client. And then we're going to fetch a single song. So we're going to do prisma.song. And then instead of find many, we're going to do find one. Now you might be thinking, why did you initialize the Prisma client multiple times? You could absolutely abstract this out to a shared library, and you could make a shared library method to fetch all the songs. For the sake of this workshop, we're just going to keep it in line here, but you can absolutely extract that out as your application scales. So for this song, as I find one song, we're going to want to include the artist information as well from that table. And then we're going to want to filter this. And we do that using the where property. So we want to say, sorry, I'm getting a call on Slack, which is no longer accepted. So we want to say where, and we want to say where ID equals whatever dynamic value that we pass in. So specifically, we have this params, and we want to do params at ID. Now, you might wonder where this magic ID value comes from. This is from the file name. So we could also call this song ID or YouTube ID or whatever we want to call it, and that will be reflected as a key in the params object. Now, when doing this comparison, we also want to make sure we're comparing a number to a number, and the ID in the database is number. So let's convert this over, as params at ID is going to be a string. This will fetch information about this song, and then rather than returning this hard-coded YouTube ID, we want to just return the song. So that's one piece of the puzzle here. The next piece is going to be fetching all of the songs so that we can generate all of the paths. So again, we will create a connection to Prisma client. Similar to the index route, we will fetch all of the songs. And we want to find many. And then in this case, we don't necessarily need to include the artist model, because really all we're doing is pulling the IDs here. So we have all of the different songs available. Instead of hard coding this list with only an ID of 1, we want to iterate over those songs and convert those into all the paths that are available. So let's cut this out and say for all the songs, we want to map over each song, and we want to return an object that has this same structure with params. So for each song, we want params and then some ID. And that ID is going to be song at ID which is again a number. So we want to make sure that we go back to a string here. So now for every song, it's going to generate a object in that array containing the ID. So we're available for every path. So this is looking good, but you might notice that we lost our YouTube video. So song at YouTube ID doesn't exist. If I go back to localhost, you'll see that I can now navigate to 1 and 2 and 3, but there's no YouTube video. And the reason for that is that we don't have a YouTube ID on the model yet. So what we want to do is go back to our schema. And if we look at the song model, we want to add a little bit more information here. And I think this is a good opportunity to start talking about Prisma and some of the extra functionality that we get with databases. So Prisma Migrate is a tool that allows us to change our database schema, whether that's creating new tables or adding columns to existing tables, and run what we call schema migrations. So if I want to add a new column to this table, let's say it's a YouTube ID that is a string that is optional, and I save this, what I want to do is run a database migration on this. So if I go to package.json, again, I have some helpful scripts already laid out for you here. And what we want to do is run yarn db save. This is going to create the schema migration. We'll give it a name. And you see that it shows that the YouTube ID was added, and it creates a new folder under migrations so that we can track this through source control. So we have a migration. Now we need to run the migration and apply it to our database. And we do that through yarn db up. So now you see that it ran one migration successfully, and our new column is added to the song table. If I run yarn db again using Prisma Studio, I will be able to inspect my database and go check out the song table and see that I now have a null YouTube ID for all of the songs. So if I wanted to go back to my original finished example and click into here, and let's say I open up this song, I can pull this ID from the URL. We don't need that anymore. Go back to my visual editor and say, let's populate this YouTube ID. It's going to say that I have one pending change, and I want to save changes. And it's that easy. You don't have to worry about setting up a node script or doing any other magic. It's nice that this is just a great functionality of Prisma Studio, and it's providing all of those tools kind of in one package for the whole life cycle of managing that database. So now that we have that, we can kill that and rerun our application, where we've now saved off a YouTube ID for the ID of 1. So if we go back to songs at 1, oh, whoops. I forgot to regenerate our client as well. So if I do, I ran a database migration and I changed what the schema was of Prisma and what it was expecting. So when I run yarn generate, what this is doing is going into node modules and regenerating a new Prisma client. So now that this new Prisma client is generated, I have that type safe access to all of the fields, even the new YouTube ID that I added. So if I rerun yarn dev, now we should see songs at 1 showing the correct YouTube ID. So this is a great start. If I go to songs at 2, I don't have anything because I didn't put that information in the database, but we could totally do that going forward. So this is a pretty good start. We've been able to query data from the database for songs, show a list of songs, and show how we can use dynamic routes to build these pages and show information about an individual song, and then also run a database migration to add more information. I'm going to pause for a minute and catch up on the chat and make sure that I have answered all the questions. Let me see if I can find the Q&A. Will the recording of this workshop be shared? Yes, it will be shared. I believe that will be up to the Prisma team for sending out the recordings. What about the security when we put the backend code into the same project the front end is? I touched on this a little bit with the code generation, but basically because we're not shipping that information to the front end and including that in the client-side browser bundle, we don't have to worry about the security there because it's only accessed in the Node.js context. Next.js makes it very convenient to develop with TypeScript. Does Prisma generate types from our schema to use in the Next.js project? Yes, absolutely. So that's a really big benefit of using Prisma with TypeScript is that you get that type-safe access. For this demo, I'm just using JavaScript, but Next.js also has first-class support for TypeScript. So it would be very easy to then convert this over and get that live feedback with a strongly typed application. Can I please go over getStaticPaths versus getStaticProps again? Absolutely. So let me do that one more time. I'll go back to this dynamic route because I think it's the best example of that. So with 9.3, Next.js introduced not only getStaticProps, but getStaticPaths. And these two methods are used to take your dynamic data and then create static files. So you don't have to use them both. You can use one or the other, but in general, you're probably going to need to use both in combination with something like a dynamic route. So for example, getStaticProps, I want to query my database, fetch some information, and then forward that as a prop to my React component. And since I'm exporting this React component from this file, then it is rendered to the screen. getStaticPaths, I want to say, given some data, I want to generate X number of pages. So for this example specifically, given 5 songs in my database, I want to make sure that there are 5 different routes, one for each ID of the song. Another thing that I'll just quickly mention, there's also a static site or a new method added in 9.3, get server-side props if you want to do server-side rendering. But these two are the keys for using static site generation with Next.js. Let's see, will the song example be open sourced? Yes, it will be open sourced. It is right now. So the starter repo that we went with, if you take this and you just remove starter from the end, you can see the completed example here. If you prefer to follow along from the completed code, you can do that as well. This also has a link to the deployed application too. Do you use get server-side props as well? So for this example, I'm not going to use get server-side props, but you absolutely could if you wanted to do server-side rendering. The focus on this is going to be on generating that static output. Let's see. Is it possible to create dynamic routes in Next.js? Yes, it is. So this, all it takes is this bracket syntax to allow you to create a dynamic route. There's also the concept of a catch-all dynamic route, which is probably helpful to mention just so that you know it exists. Let me see if I can find a good example of that inside of their docs. Basically, if you do ... whatever, you're going to get an object that allows you to do nested routes inside of it. So a prominent use case of this is for if you have like a headless CMS that sends back structured data with nested routes. You can use one of these catch-all routes to essentially get back an object that has all of that information inside of here. I would highly recommend the Next.js docs too. They're pretty well laid out and provide some solid examples for how some of these things work, like dynamic routing. So I mentioned that params is passed in here if we want to access that value. But if you were doing something completely client-side rendered too, you can also use this use router hook, which is going to allow you to pull values directly off of there, whether that's a query parameter or the dynamic value that you passed in. Why would one prefer Next.js over Gatsby for static site generation? This one is a tricky and nuanced question because it likely comes down to the needs of your company or the application you're trying to build. In my opinion, I think Gatsby really shines if you have prior experience with GraphQL because it is strongly opinionated to use GraphQL. You can use it without, but it is opinionated in that way. And it also shines with a really excellent plugin infrastructure and some really cool new features like the recipes functionality, which allows you to quickly install packages and run scripts. So there's a lot of cool things coming out of the Gatsby team. Big shout out to them. Next.js, I think the big differentiator between it and something like Gatsby is that with Gatsby and doing that static site generation, if you need to do a server-side rendered route, at least currently, you can't do that on a per route basis. I know that they're exploring adding this. I don't know how far along that is, but right now, I believe that Next.js is really the only framework that allows you to have that granularity on a per page basis. Another thing that I personally like about Next.js is that it is not opinionated in the way that you want to fetch your data. So whether you want to do GraphQL or not, it allows you to do both, but it doesn't necessarily come baked in with GraphQL. And I've found that from a beginner's point of view, adding GraphQL, while it is helpful for people who already know about it, can be a barrier to entry in understanding that framework. So there's really pros and cons to both. I think both are really leading this space in making React applications more accessible to more developers and kind of scaling that out to go further. There's a couple of Next router alternatives. Are they even necessary with the latest Next.js version? I don't know which ones you're specifically talking about, but probably not. There were third-party routers that had been made to add new functionality before it landed in master in Next.js. And a lot of the functionality that's in the latest version of Next.js should satisfy almost all of those needs. The only thing that I can think of off the top of my head is internationalization, which is something that is a very, very difficult and nuanced subject. But luckily, the Next.js team has announced they're going to be working on this and building it into the framework, which is great news. So I'm looking forward to that and seeing where that goes. I'm going to pause on questions now and get back into it, and then I will come back to questions here a little bit later. So what I want to do now that we have at least a shell of our application going is start adding some styling to make this look a little bit better and dive into a new topic and expose our breadth of knowledge a little bit more. And to do that, I want to talk about Chakra UI, which is my preferred way of styling applications. So we could absolutely style this with CSS. We could absolutely style this with Sass, but I prefer to use CSS and JS as it scales to larger applications. And Chakra is one of my favorite solutions for this. Not only does it allow you to easily build applications with a consistent theme abiding to a design system, but it also comes baked in with some really well-designed, composable, and accessible components. Some that are really difficult that if you wanted to build on your own, take a lot of time, or you have to be pulling components from a lot of different places. Whereas this is a pretty solid batch that has allowed me to build some pretty large applications with this, not having to escape the bounds of this framework. So what we're going to do is we're going to add Chakra UI to do some CSS and JS and style our application. So I'm going to add some dependencies here. Let me just put a link to this in the chat for those following along if you want to copy those dependencies. And by default, Chakra gives us a theme that is based on Tailwind CSS. So it uses some of the same values and spacing scales, which is great because I think Tailwind CSS does an excellent job. So to make that theme available to our application, we need to wrap it in a theme provider. And this gives us a great opportunity to talk about a Next.js specific feature that you'll likely run into when developing Next.js applications, which is I want to share a layout between multiple components. And I don't want to have to add that on both the song at ID page and the index page. I want to share it. And to do that, we can do an advanced feature of Next.js, which is overriding this _app file. Now this file is used to initialize pages. So it allows you to persist layout or keep state or just put any global CSS into this page. And what we want to do specifically is make a new file, _app.js, and we can just copy over this example. I'll put this in the chat as well for those who want to copy along. And this gives us just the framework of overriding the app that Next.js provides. And we want to say this component, while we love it, we want to wrap it in a theme provider. And then render the component as a child of that. So what this will do is it will use React context to expose the Chakra theme to all components in our application. So now we're able to quickly pull values based on our theme and build scalable UIs that adhere to a design system. The other thing I want to talk about is a CSS reset, which if you haven't heard of this, it essentially just resets all of the default browser styles that are included so that you can get consistency across browser easier. So let's include that as well too. And save this and then restart our, I'm going to regenerate our Prisma client since I already ran yarn, and then I'm going to restart our application locally. So I would assume now that we would lose our default browser link styles. Okay, so because I had that CSS reset, I lose those default browser styles, but now it gives us the ability to use Chakra's components to start building this out into a little bit more cohesive experience. So what we're going to do now is create these song cards. And to do that, we can utilize the list components. And what these do, they are essentially wrappers around just a UL or a list item, but it allows you to use style props. Now, I'm going to touch on that in a second, but I want to just quickly add this so you can see what it looks like. So the UL is a list, and then the list item is a list item. And I auto imported those from Chakra. So if I refresh, move back to here, nothing's going to change, right? Because it's basically the exact same thing. But now, since I have these components that I can use style props, I can do something like, let's say I want every list item to have a margin. It's that easy to then add a prop and see those values updated live. Now you might be wondering, okay, but where did these magic values come from? And the underlying system that runs Chakra UI is what's called styled system. And what this does is it allows you to make consistent UIs conforming to a specific theme. So you get to define which props are exposed on each component to allow you to style it. So anything that you could normally do in CSS is going to be available via shorthand as a prop. And some of these even have shorthands to make them easier. Like instead of writing out margin, you can just do M. Or instead of writing padding, you can just do M. And this has really, really improved my developer workflow and how fast I can get things done. It just reduces some of the cycles of, I need to come up with a class name for my CSS, or I need to abstract this out into a styled component. This doesn't mean that you should just always do style props in line, because as you'll see, it makes sense to still use the reusable nature of React and extract that out. So what we want to do is, let's add some border to this. I'm just going to do 1 pixel solid border, and we're going to do a border color of, let's do gray at 200. Now I want to quickly talk about that value of 8 that I just used and this value of gray at 200. If we go back to Chakra's theme, these aren't just magic values, they're actually pulled and constrained to a theme. So gray 200 pulls this value based on Tailwind's default color set. And then 8 actually corresponds to the spacing scale, which there's a pretty helpful mental model here where 8 is roughly equivalent to 2 rem, which is roughly equivalent to 32 pixels. I'm seeing a couple questions about theme UI. Theme UI is very similar to Chakra in a lot of ways. Theme UI was the next project after Styled System. And Chakra UI, I think the creator had said that, you know, if theme UI would have been more finalized at the time he was creating it, he probably would have chose to use that instead as the underlying system. The big difference between theme UI and Chakra UI is that theme UI pushes the use of a JS object for styling instead of style props. And it also, it does come baked in with some other components via packages, whereas Chakra is more of a complete system. So not only does it have the style props, it also has a more well-documented list of comprehensive components. And I know that the Gatsby team is working on theme UI, improving that component set and adding some functionality there. So both are great options, worth checking out. So we have a border, let's go back here. We have a border, some border color. We want to throw a little bit of border radius on here as well. Close that. We'll just say 4. Another cool shorthand that we can do is X or Y. So margin Y will only add margin on the Y axis. And then let's just say we want to make the background of this white, because we're eventually going to make the background of the entire application to be gray. Now, if I save this, one of the things you're probably wondering why it's auto formatting when I save it. If I go to my VS Code settings, I have a format on save turned on. And what this is doing is it's using prettier, which I have defined as a prettier RC file inside of this repository that tells it how to style things. I would really recommend this. It just reduces some of the overhead in these workflows because it makes the decisions for you, and it avoids comments on code reviews about how you want to format your code. So it's pretty easy to set up. The auto formatting when you save is very nice because you can kind of just spam on your keyboard, and even if it doesn't look good, you just hit save and then it all magically just looks great. So this is looking a little bit better. Now what we want to do is add, let's see, we want to add the name of the song and then the artist, and then also an image for the album cover. So let's go back to here, and we're going to take this song name. And one thing I want to talk about is the first child of a Next.js link is supposed to be an A tag. And the reason for that is because this link doesn't actually get rendered into the DOM. This is just used to then forward that information to the A tag. So you could do that directly, but what I want to do is I want to use a flex component from Chakra UI, which my editor is not recognizing for some reason, but that's fine. And I want to say I'm going to render that as an A tag. So the first child, the actual HTML that gets rendered here is going to be an A tag. And then I can use a really helpful function here called pass href, which will forward this information and this href down to the A tag. And that will be the proper accessibility for this link. So we have that, and now inside of this A tag, because we want the entire card to be a link, we want to have an image, and we want to have information about the song name and the artist. Looks like there's some comments about auto format. Yeah, I use Prettier. Hopefully it's working for everyone. If it's not working, you can turn that option off in your settings and just not use it, but should be working. Let me know if other people are experiencing that issue. So the first thing that we're going to want in here is an image. Again, my autocomplete hates me now. That's fine. And then we want to have a stack. And a stack is a shorthand helper component inside of Chakra that allows you to lay things out with space in between. So whether that's vertically or horizontally. So we want to have a stack of things. And the first one is going to be a heading, which will be the song name. And the second one will be just some text. And the reason that we use these is so that we can have some default styles included with these components, and then also so that we can use style props on the style props as props on the React component. So we want the song name, and then we want the artist name below. So if you remember in this file, we included information about the artist, and that makes the artist model available on that song. So we can do song.artist.name, and that will allow us to access the name of the artist. Now, my auto import wasn't working, so I'll have to manually type these out. We had flex, image, heading, text. I think that was everything. Nope, no, I missed one. Stack. Okay, so that's looking a little bit better. I haven't defined anything in the image yet because we don't have any images, but I can start to set this up so it at least looks somewhat correctly. So let's say we want this to be maybe 100 pixels wide, and we want it to fit the entire 100 pixels with a cover fit. The source for this image, we don't have defined yet. So for now, let's just say it's the name. And then with every image, we want to have an alt tag for accessibility. So the alt tag for this image will just be the name of the song, or it could be the album name, but we'll just do the song name here. And then let's also throw a little bit of margin on the right side of this. So this will not have any images. Oh, whoops, song.name. This will not have any images yet because we don't have anything in our database, but it at least gets the shell of what this will look like. Now the heading looks a little large to me, so let's change that size from being XL to large, and then let's also make the color of the text be a little lighter. So rather than black, we could do gray at, let's say, 700. Nice. That's looking a lot better. Because we reduced the size of the heading, I think we're going to need a little bit of margin on the top of this stack. Okay, that's looking really good. Now let's add some album URLs. So we've already walked through the flow of running a database migration, and we'll want to just do something very similar here. So if we go back to our schema, we also want to have an album cover URL, and we'll say that's a string as well, and it can be optional. I'm going to tear down my server, and if you remember the commands, it was yarn db save to create that migration. and we'll say this is album. That adds the album cover URL. It was yarn db up to run that migration and apply that new column. And then yarn db to view the database with Prisma Studio and see our new column. So now we have album cover URL. I'm gonna go back to our finished example and just copy this image URL here. You could put whatever you wanted to for those following along at home. And I'm just gonna paste this in here and hit save. And just for fun, I'm going to do that. Well, it's fine. So I'm going to kill that server and restart the application. And we don't need this anymore, but now we should be able to hopefully see it pull the correct album cover URL after I regenerate the schema. I always forget to do that. So I updated that schema with the database migration. I regenerate the Prisma schema in my node modules. Now I run the application and I use album cover URL to access that new value. So it compiles and boom, we see our new album cover pop up. This is looking really good. If I click into one of these though, we want to show a little bit more information on this page than just the YouTube video. So let's go into this file and do a little bit of styling cleanup as well. Rather than just having this iframe, we're going to want to have the name of the song and the artist as well as also a button back too. So let's cut this and we'll just use a new box, which is essentially the equivalent of a div, but it has all the style props available through Chakra. And inside of that, we're gonna want some heading for the song's name. We're going to want some text for the song.artist.name. We can keep that iframe in here now. That'll be in the middle. And I need to import box, heading, and text. Since again, my auto import died on me. Box, heading, text. Cool. That's looking good. The next thing we want is a button down at the bottom so that we can link back to the home page. So let's do a link again from Next, and it's going to link to the home page. And we're going to pass that href down, which is a Next.js specific property. We're going to pass that down to whatever the child is that we want. And let's just use a Chakra UI button. And that's going to just say back. So remember, the first child needs to be an A. So I will render this as an A. And we'll put a little bit of margin on the top. And another cool thing is we can even put icons inside of our buttons. So if we go back to the Chakra docs, there's a whole set of icons that you can include in the buttons. And I want to do specifically a left icon of, let's say, arrow back. So I've imported link already. I need to add button. Now we have a link back to the home page with an arrow in it. And this should do a quick client-side transition to take you from one page to the other. Let's see, I could also clean this up a little bit. We'll make this the same color as the other one. So gray 700, and Actually, let's put a little bit of margin on the bottom here. Okay, that looks a little bit better. I feel like this could even take some margin on the top. Nice. Okay, this is starting to look really good. The next thing I want to talk about is making styling changes that will impact across the entirety of the application. So we talked about the app.js file giving you that shared layout that allows you to make changes in both places. We can also have the ability to add global styles that will impact the entirety of our application. So if we go into app, what we can do is use global, which will come from emotion. Let me import that. And then we can also use this CSS prop. So inside of global, we want to apply some global styles. And we want to say those styles are equal to, and we use this CSS prop that emotion provides to allow us to write our styles inline here and also use theming variables if we wanted to. So we're going to say that we want the background of our entire application to be just a lighter shade of gray, so we can target the entire body from inside of here because it's a global style. So we could say we want the background color to be just some hex value, which I have this hex value already saved off. It's just some gray value, but you could pick whatever you wanted to. And then we also want to target this next element. And I'm just going to quickly show what this is. If I were to pull up the Chrome DevTools and inspect, you'll see that underneath the body, I have a div with the ID of __ next. This wraps the entirety of the application, and you can see that right now it's only taking up the height of the contents that it has. Since we're setting the background on this application, we want to make sure that this takes up the full height. So we're going to just turn this into a flex container, and we'll make it column. And we want to make sure that its height goes all the way. So we'll do min height of 100% of the view height. Now, another thing I did to kind of clean up the constraints is set a max width on this so that it's more focused on the center. So we'll say maybe 600 pixels. And then if we use margin of 0 auto, this is the shorthand to say on the top and bottom it's 0, but on the left and right, we're going to automatically resize that to fit the content. So the combination of these two will center the content in the middle, no more than 600 pixels. And we can put some padding on here as well too. So that looks pretty good to me. Nice. So you see that the background went gray. The content got centered in the middle, and we were able to see the CSS changes apply in the global context. So if I click inside of here, I'm able to see this song, and it still has that gray background. It's still constrained within the 600 pixel width, and it applies to the entirety of our application. The other thing that we could do is go back to our index route and extract this out to make it a little bit more reusable. So we're rendering 5 different songs right now, but this could become much more complex in the component that we're rendering here. So we might want to take this and just cut this and say that this is going to be a song component. Now we could define that component inside of this file. We could pull it out to a components directory. Really, it's up to you on how you want to structure your application, but pulling this out will allow you to have a more composable, reusable UI. You might want to show these songs in another place. So then the next piece is we have a song, right? We need to spread, which is an ES6 feature, all of the properties of the song object. We're going to spread all of these onto the song component. So if I go up to song, now I have the ability to destructure the props and pull out name and ID and album cover URL. And then I can even clean this up a little bit and just remove that. Oh. And artist. That looks good to me. See if I missed anything. Nope, I didn't miss anything. So then now you could extract this component out to a different file. It really just allows you to create a little bit more composable, reusable UIs. So I think this is a decent point to start talking about where you could take this further, and then make sure I have plenty of time to get questions and also gather feedback. So you're probably wondering, okay, this looks great, right? I'm gonna stop sharing. Well, I won't. I'll keep sharing my screen for now. You're probably wondering, this looks great, but how do I scale this? Like, how do I take it to that next level? And you might be thinking, I have really dynamic data needs. How can I then apply this to a database with, you know, thousands or millions of rows and still have it be up to date? And what if I wanted to add the ability to add in new songs? And luckily, there's a lot of improvements being made in the static site generation state of the world, or the Jamstack space, where it makes it very easy to scale up these type of applications. So I want to quickly define what Jamstack is for those who don't know. Jamstack is the combination of JavaScript, APIs, and markup. So in this example, we're using JavaScript with Next. Our API is talking to Prisma. And then the markup that we're sending, in this case, really is just the HTML that we're providing over the wire. It could be Markdown. It could be a variety of different things. So the innovations in this space have allowed us to scale this out when we have tens of thousands of hundreds of pages. And there's really a couple different ways that you can do this. If you want to stick within the bounds of a completely static site, you can utilize platforms like Vercel or others that allow you to incrementally rebuild this content on the fly. So what that means is, right now, you're taking this content and you're generating it at build time. But you might want to say, I want to add a modal where I want to add in a new song or put new data into the database rather than manually editing it with Prisma Studio. I want to add new data into this database, and then I want to see this page updated. So rather than building your site only at build time, you want it to be able to regenerate and update when that data changes. With Gatsby, this is the concept of incremental builds through Gatsby Cloud or with Netlify. And with Next.js in 9.4, they've introduced this concept of, incremental static regeneration. Now, this is really how you can take this example and then scale it to something to the effect of Twitter, which is what this example here shows at static_tweet.now.sh. Basically, inside of getStaticProps, which I just showed, you can say, for every second or whatever period I want this page to revalidate in the background. Go and create the newest version of that page, rebuild, and only if that was successful, then I want to serve that content up to my users. So in doing that, you're going to get the fastest site possible because you're always serving static content. You get to keep using Prisma and your database that you love while still producing that output that is really fast and really easy to host in multiple places. Plus, as I'm sure many of you are aware, caching is just really difficult, especially with really dynamic data. So being able to use something that's based on stale while revalidate, which is very popular, and use that to help you update your content in the background, most of the time simplifies the ability of how you want to do caching, and those providing a CDN that allows you to swap out that content if it is successful. So that would be my answer of how you could take this further if it wanted to be static. If you want it to be server-side rendered, what that looks like is instead of doing getStaticProps, you're doing getServer-side-props with Next.js. And again, it's in the Node.js context, but it is going directly to the server in the Node context, fetching information from the database, and that's happening at runtime instead of at build time. So both are great options. It really just depends on what is best for your use case. One thing I want to quickly show too is just deploying this example that we have so we can get something out there. And to do that, I'm just going to use Vercel to quickly deploy this from the command line. So I already have the Vercel command line installed. If you don't, you can just go to vercel.com to download that. Or you can just watch me do it live if you don't want to actually deploy your own. But what that looks like once you have it installed is you can either run Vercel or VC, and that will allow you to set up and deploy your project. So I might say I want to set up and deploy this project, scoped to me. I've already deployed this one time, but we're just going to say, let's link it to, we don't want to link it to a different project. We'll say this is Prisma Day. Now what this is going to do is deploy this application and automatically determine what my settings are. So it recognizes that I'm using Next.js. It understands that next build is the command to generate the production version of my site. And I don't want to override these settings, so we'll just use the defaults. And now it will take the command of next build, which is going to generate the static output of my site based on my Prisma database, and deploy that to a global CDN that users all over the world can hit and have really fast response times. This workflow is really great. You can deploy from the command line, or you can also deploy through either a GitHub, a GitLab, or Bitbucket integration. I mean, let's be honest, most of us probably use GitHub. You install that integration, and all you have to do is git push, and it will push up to your repository. And then when you open a pull request, the integration will essentially do what it's doing right now, which is deploy a copy of this and leave a link to it on your PR. So for a tangible example, I can just kind of show you what this looks like if you're curious. On my personal site, I use this exact same stack, and I just closed the PR the other day where I was forgetting a period. And what this looks like with the integration is it automatically deploys it for you. It leaves a link. It shows you what routes have changed, and puts a little image here, what they call a deploy preview. So you can go out and view a live immutable deployment with these changes. And then I also have this Lighthouse metrics integration that I also threw on here as well too. So that's kind of what that looks like. Looks like my deployment finished. It's in production at prismaday.vercel.app. And you see, I see basically the exact same thing that I had locally, which is me missing some data and almost there, but very similar to what the completed example is without me spending the time to add that data. So yeah, deployment is pretty simple. You can also use Netlify if you wanted to, or other static site deployment tools. I'm just the most familiar with Vercel, so that's why I like using that. I'm going to now pause and go through questions because I've been rambling on for a while now. It looks like there are a few. Does Prettier format the Prisma schema file too? I believe it does. I know I've seen it do it before, but for some reason it's not going right now. I might have to explicitly define which file is allowed, and maybe it's not recognizing .prisma, but it should. I've seen it work before. Are there any intricacies that we should be aware of for Postgres? For example, if we want to connect a Postgres database on DigitalOcean or Heroku. I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but for this specific example, I'm using SQLite. I haven't worked specifically with Postgres and Prisma, but I've used Postgres before just by itself. So I don't know that I can comment exactly on that, but that's a great question to take to the Prisma Slack channel, which a lot of other people are in there asking questions as well, and you'll get some direct one-on-one interaction with people in the Prisma team. Are static sites good for SEO? I love this question because it's very important, and it kind of gives an opportunity to talk about this segue in the industry from, we started with, well, 5 years ago, we'll say, there was a rise in the single page application, client-side rendered, React, Vue, Angular type applications, right? And these got really popular because they were easy to create. But then we got a little further down the line and we realized, oh crap, we're loading all of this data on the client side. This actually isn't good for SEO because it takes a little bit for the Google crawler, the Google bot to pick up that information and display it on the screen. That kind of led to the rise or revitalization of server-side rendered frameworks. And that was really where Next.js started. Its whole focus was on server-side rendering pages so that you had better SEO. A great example of this is a site like Spectrum, if you've heard of it. It's a community for Q&A. They needed that to be server-side rendered so that all the things were very quickly indexed by Google. One caveat to that I want to mention is Google still does index client-side rendered content. It's just not as fast. And which is really important too if you're trying to do like meta tags. You want that to be instant. So server-side rendering brought that revitalization back to, server-side rendering with PHP, how it used to be back in the day, or even further back, I guess. But then static sites, specifically static site generation, has that same benefit of great SEO because you're still serving that markup from the server. So what you might consider server-side rendering with something like Next.js, static site generation, it's still serving that markup from the server, but it can be cached behind a CDN. It's only computed at build time, or with some of these newer tools, it can be computed in the background at runtime. So absolutely, yes, static sites are good for SEO. Can you use values from the theme object when doing global styling with emotion? I believe so. That is a great question. I believe so. We could try just doing like 8 in here and see if that works. Oh wait, this is the deployed version. Let me restart this application up. I don't know if I need to do string interpolation here to get that to work, but we will find out. I don't know. I don't think that's working. I might have to do something differently there. I would think it's possible, but I don't have a great answer for that. Can I center the detail pages things vertically? Yeah, you could definitely center this vertically if you wanted to. I don't know. I just, for whatever reason, decided to do it this way. But yeah, anything's possible with CSS. Let's see. If I need to fetch data later in my client code, once it has rendered from Prisma, do I have to use a Next.js API route? I don't know that you have to, but that's probably the pattern that I would recommend. So for example, if we generate this at build time with this list of songs. And then maybe we want to fetch some additional information that hydrates only when we're on the client side. You could absolutely create a Next.js API route that talks to Prisma as well and fetches some information. For those of you who don't know, I'll just quickly explain what a Next.js API route is. It essentially allows you to, again, run in the node context and provides an opportunity for you to create a serverless function that will fetch some information from some API or some database and then serve that up as an API. So if I made a new file at, I can actually just show this really quick. There's a really good example in the docs. If I just take this very simple example of an API route and I make a new file at pages API hello.js, and I put this in here, it's going to return a 200 with some JSON information. So if I go to localhost/API/hello, it uses that same file system-based routing to allow you to generate these API routes to use that node context and fetch information. So if you wanted to do client-side rendering, you could absolutely use this approach to use an API route in combination with fetching on the client side. Let's see. Can you comment on the difference between the different use cases for server-side rendering and static site generation? Yeah, absolutely. So the way server-side rendering used to exist, it's not disappearing, but it is evolving. And what I mean by that is, more often than not, a lot of people enjoy the benefits of static sites, whether that's they have less opportunities for database vulnerabilities, or they have less opportunities for downtime, or they're cheaper, faster. You know, you can just serve up these static files and put them behind a CDN. So people are wanting to do that. There's a huge push, and that's kind of what the Jamstack is all about. But then, as you know, there is still a need when you have really dynamic data that updates very frequently. So if I go back to that Facebook example, right, that information needs to be up to date immediately at every request on a global scale. So it's a good option and a good use case for server-side rendering. What we're seeing is that for some really large sites that have pretty dynamic data, we can still do this approach using incremental static regeneration, which allows you to rebuild that content in a static way at runtime and scale that out pretty large. So a good example of this is Barstool Sports website. This is actually a completely static website, and it's hosted on Vercel using the incremental static regeneration. So even something at the scale of this with a lot of content pushed out pretty regularly, it can show that it can be scaled to not only big news sites or big e-commerce sites. You can take that static model further and further and further. And outside of Next.js, this is kind of what I was talking about with Gatsby builds as well, which is, you know, if you have a absolutely massive Gatsby site with 100,000 pages, that rebuild time used to take a while, maybe 20 minutes. And Gatsby Cloud, the whole premise behind those changes is to make those rebuilds faster so that you can continue the benefits of static. Let's see. Could you please briefly touch on how Apollo client would fit into this? So if you're using static site generation, you don't necessarily need to use Apollo client because you're not having to rerun anything else on the client side. You're probably, if you still want to use GraphQL, you probably could use, a library like GraphQL request that would still allow you to, inside of that Node.js context, so for example, inside of getStaticProps, you could still make a request to some API using GraphQL and get that information back. So for example, like the GitHub GraphQL API, you could make a request to here, fetch some information, and get it back. Do you use Tailwind CSS as well? I have read a lot about it, and I understand the problem it solves, but I haven't really tinkered with it much myself. It's definitely gaining a lot of adoption, and I think it makes a lot of sense for people who want extremely performant applications and they want to ship as little amount of JavaScript as possible. So there's a time and a place for it, but I haven't messed with it personally myself. In a big project, could you use static and server-side pages? Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the things that is really interesting and helpful about Next.js, which is you don't have to choose one or the other. So if you're hearing me talk about all this and you think, wow, like the static stuff sounds really cool, but given the constraints of our application, there's probably no way that we're going to move this one page from being server-side rendered. And the cool thing about Next is that you don't have to choose. You can still keep everything within that same framework and then say, maybe on this page, I want to do server rendering from my Prisma and database, or maybe on this page, I want to do a completely static marketing page and blog pages, and that'll be the best performance they can put behind CDN. So really you have the ability to do both options. What is the full stack you would do if you were to start a new large project? That's a great question. Really hard to answer because it probably depends on the project space. For example, if it's in like a news site or if it's in e-commerce or what the domain is. I know for sure for me personally, it comes down to the tools that I have the most familiarity with. So if you're a developer and you're already really proficient in Ruby on Rails, it might make sense just to stick with what you know, and you can still explore with new technologies like Next.js until you feel proficient with it. So for me personally, I've really grown to love React and using Next.js, so I would definitely use that for the front end. My personal site, the stack is React and Next.js. I deploy with Vercel, and I use serverless functions through API routes that allow me to add dynamic bits of data to my site. So even though I'm serving up a really dynamic site, I can still use serverless functions to fetch information about various metrics and then tie that back into a completely static site. So this information is still fetched on the client side and then brought back to a completely static site. So that's kind of the stack that I prefer to use. I also really like Firebase for just a really quick way to do auth and also have maybe a real-time database or just some sort of NoSQL database. But yeah, it definitely depends on, when we're talking large scale, you're probably thinking some kind of CMS, and there is a million different like CMS or headless CMS providers out there. Let's see. When revalidate is enabled, does Next server-side render that page initially when the new data is available, but then serve a static page on the second refresh? So the way it works is, let's say I'm visiting my static page and my revalidation time is 1 second. So for that whole second, it is serving up a static cached version of the site from the CDN. And after that time period has elapsed, so at 1 second, and somebody else makes a request to the site, it recognizes that that period has elapsed. So it goes back to the server in the background. It generates a new version of the site. And if that was successful, then it will swap out the cache for the new version of the static site. So there's no downtime. There's no waiting on a server-side rendered route. That all happens in the background. Do you want to show us how we could do a dark and light theme switcher? That is definitely a rabbit hole. I can point you in the right direction, but it would probably take a while to actually set up all the code for it. But for example, on my website in the top left, I have a dark mode, light mode switcher, and all of this code is available on my personal repository. And probably the best example to just give you a really quick idea of what this looks like is if you go into the app.js. I'm using Chakra again for this, and it has the concept of a color mode provider that makes both themes or color modes available. And then up here, here's an example of where you can actually hook into that color mode and determine if it's light or dark. So I use that value to determine which type of syntax highlighting I want to do on my site. So if you want a tangible example with some code, just check out my personal site. But Chakra's docs are pretty decent on learning more about the color provider as well. Let's see. How does Next.js know that it needs to register a new route for one of these dynamic routes that are being statically rendered when a new record is added in the database? So the way it's set up right now, right, it only knows about the 5 songs that are available. And one thing that I wasn't sure if we were going to have time to talk about, but it seems like we do, is fallback false. And this, I believe, answers exactly what you're looking for. So let me see if I can find a good example inside here. If I try to go to index/20 right now, right, it doesn't exist. So I'm going to get a 404. What fallback false will allow you to do is say, actually, I want this to be true. So I need to handle the fallback scenario and show a loading state. So if that doesn't exist, show a loading state and allow you to then generate a new static version of that site. So let me put a link to this in the chat. It's really cool. I haven't messed with it too much personally, but there's a lot of applications for this. The static tweet example uses this. So if I get a random tweet and I click on this, it's statically generated. And if I go, let's just say get a different one here. Yeah, it gets statically generated. So there's this like skeleton page if it's never been visited before. So pretty cool. Other questions? How would you compare Next.js to Redwood and Blitz? That is, if they can be compared. So Blitz.js is a framework on top of Next.js. So framework on top of Next, which is a framework on top of React. So we've got layers to it, but what Blitz is trying to solve is even addressing more of the full scope of building an application. So handling, like I've made an opinionated choice here to use Next.js with Prisma. What Blitz does is it chooses that for you by default. So Blitz applications use Prisma under the hood, and they're also hoping to add authentication directly into that framework as well. So it's more akin to a Ruby on Rails scenario. Redwood uses React in Prisma, but it does not use Next.js. So it does not do server-side rendering. I don't know if that is in the plans for them, but if you're already familiar with Next.js, then it probably makes more sense to check out Blitz if that's something that you're interested in. There's also something to be said about being locked in 3 levels of framework dependency deep. Like some people already have reservations about even having a framework on top of React. For me personally, I think it works great, but everyone's entitled to their own opinion there. Adding another framework on top, while it will solve a very valid problem, must be used with caution. Can we use Prisma to implement authentication without depending on a third-party service? Yeah, absolutely. If you wanted to, you could set up your own user table. You could, hash and salt passwords inside of that table and then store off user information in a cookie. You're 100% able to roll your own given whatever database you want and still have that type-safe access to all of your tables. Do you think storing the theme config in the database and using the Prisma client to get it and apply it to our React application is a good styling solution. What do you think the cons are? I really feel like the only time that would be useful is if you were updating your theme like very, very, very frequently and it needed to be dynamically changed like on the fly via an API or something. I think for probably most use cases, it's okay to just have 1 or 2 or 3, however many themes that you want, just as a statically defined object inside of your application. And then you're just a deploy away from updating those values. So I think the pro of that approach is that it makes it a lot simpler. The con of storing it in the database would be just added complexity on where that information lives. It's definitely possible though, if you wanted to. Let's see, is it possible to use an authentication process only with Next.js Prisma without Auth0 or a custom GraphQL server? Yeah, I kind of just answered this one. 100% you could roll your own if you wanted to. Any recommendation for follow-up literature when it comes to swapping out SQLite for a scalable database? I don't personally have a recommendation, but I'm guessing there's some really good content in the Prisma docs on this. This is pretty cool, but I worry about scale. Could I delegate the data fetching interaction via a domain interface that asserts business rules, avoiding duplication of these via the pages themselves? I don't totally understand this question, and it might just be my my stupidity, but I think what you're saying is you're just worried about, at least in the example I showed on a small scale, how you would take this a little bit further. And hopefully I see that this question was from a little bit earlier, but hopefully I explained that when I talked about the 2 different paths with taking this further, whether you want to go all static or taking it further, whether you want to do some server-side rendering. Can we build an app using Next.js Prisma as a monolith like Rails? Kinda, absolutely. Do you consider it coupling, putting everything on Next.js? This is a really personal decision. For me personally, I don't think you're coupled that much, because while these functions are helpful and they save you time, if for some reason I wanted to migrate off of Next.js, this content is still ran in the Node.js context. So any Node.js, whether that's an API route or a standalone API, can do something that is exactly the same as this. And there are other solutions to the problem that Next.js solves, whether you want to use Gatsby or you want to use Blitz or Redwood or Vue or probably not Angular, you know, just any of these different things. There's a lot of different options. Question on production, does Prisma Studio can access? Oh, I think it's asking about what the level of access is for Prisma Studio. You got to throw jokes to Angular in there. You always got to. I don't know for sure, but I believe that Prisma Studio, it's only being ran locally. I don't know that you could expose that to be a publicly accessible URL. You probably wouldn't want that unless there was some sort of authentication piece on top. So for right now, the only way that you can use that studio is when you're running it locally. Let's see, what's the difference between getStaticProps and getInitialProps available in the previous version of Next.js? So getInitialProps was the precursor to getServer-side-props, and it still exists. There are still some small use cases for it. The big difference is that getInitialProps runs on both the client and the server. So if we think about Prisma, for example, you wouldn't want to put code connecting to your database on something that also runs on the client. So that's why functions like get server-side props and then these static site generation methods unlock that ability that allow you to do things in the Node.js context. What else here? What would be the benefit to use a static site generated setup as opposed to creating a backend API service app, use Prisma there, and then use GraphQL with some client on the front end? Does this help SEO or improve speed or something like that? So I think the main use case where you would want to have your own API that is fronting your Prisma database is if you're going to have multiple consumers. So the setup, excuse me, the setup that I have here is mostly for a monolithic application where these things are combined together and it's all in the same domain. If you're building a reusable API that maybe multiple teams or products are going to use, and it's fronted by that same, backed by that same database, then you would want that to be its own separate standalone API. So the reason that this is helpful, it's not necessarily because it makes SEO better. It is just because it removes steps from the process. So we could have absolutely put this information behind an API, and then rather than going directly to the database here, we could have just called our API. So it really depends how many people need to use that. Another question about getStaticProps and getInitialProps, which I already answered, but do you think getInitialProps is being deprecated? I don't think it will be deprecated for a while. Maybe in the future, but they've been pretty reserved about wanting to deprecate that because there's still some valid use cases for it. What would you like to say to those who claim Prisma is not stable and never will be able to build a large-scale application? I disagree. I think that with any technology, it is about the implementation, and you can absolutely use Prisma in the state it is today to build really large-scale applications, and a lot of people have. And I think we're going to continue to see adoption of Prisma when we see, even meta frameworks like Blitz or Redwood pick up a lot of steam, and they're using it under the hood whether you know it or not. And I think that will continue going into the future because, for me, who is primarily a front-end dev, who's learned the full stack as I've been a developer, databases are hard. And I think that was one of the really cool things about Prisma for me is that it just made my life a lot easier. If you want to implement an infinite scroll for the song list view, how would you implement the fetch more? So the cool thing about static generation is that you could basically paginate that on the client side, but already have all of the data. So it would feel instantaneous. If you didn't want to do that and you legitimately wanted to make a fetch more button, you could statically generate maybe the first 50 songs or something, and then you could then use client-side fetching to call some API route when you click on that button and fetch back more information. Again, since these API routes are in the Node.js context, you can query Prisma from here as well, and then deploy this as a serverless function. All right. That is a lot of great questions. Thank you, everyone, for answering those. We have a few minutes left, so what I want to do is give everyone an opportunity to answer or give me any feedback that you have. And I have a link somewhere that I will pull up. Let me see if I can find it. Hopefully everyone enjoyed this and learned something new today. Here is a link to the feedback form. Oh, beat me to it. There we go. Yeah, so thanks so much for tuning in today and all the great questions. I think I even learned a lot, and I had a lot of fun running through this with you guys and showing what you can achieve with Next.js and what you can achieve with Prisma. I think it's a really great combo. feel free to send me an email, message me on Twitter, or just reach out, check out my site if you have any more questions, and I'm happy to help. My Twitter is LeeRob with 3 E's, so LeeRob. And my website is leerob.io. And yeah, my email is me@leerob.io. So feel free to shoot me a message if you have any questions. And I appreciate you guys tuning in. And that's going to wrap it up. So have a great rest of your Thursday. And cheers.